The king ordered a rogue's baby executed, then learned the boy was his hidden son. The morning air inside the great hall of Valdoria was cold and still. King Aldric sat on his throne the way he always did, straight-backed, eyes forward, face carrying no expression that anyone could read. He had ruled this kingdom for 19 years, and in that time he had learned to keep his feelings buried so deep that even he sometimes forgot they were there. Lord Harwick stood before him, holding a folded piece of parchment in both hands. Harwick was a tall, thin man with gray at his temples, and eyes that were always calculating something. He had served Aldric since the beginning of the reign, and the king trusted him the way a man trusts a wall he has leaned against so many times he stops checking whether it is still solid. "There is a matter that requires your attention," Harwick said, placing the parchment on the table beside the throne. "A child, a boy, born 4 months ago to Lady Seraphine in the village of Morrow Hollow." Aldric said nothing. He waited. Harwick explained the situation with the calm efficiency of a man reporting weather conditions. The child's assumed father was Caden, a known outlaw who had spent years causing trouble along the kingdom's eastern roads. Caden had mocked the crown publicly on more than one occasion. He was the kind of man that stories attached themselves to, and stories about outlaws had a way of becoming dangerous when the wrong people started repeating them. The child, Harwick argued, would grow up carrying that name, that reputation, that shadow. Certain rebel groups in the outer villages would eventually use the boy as a symbol. "It was better," he said very quietly, "to handle this now, before it became a problem that could not be handled." Aldric looked at the parchment for a long moment. Then he asked the only question he thought to ask. "Is the woman to be punished as well?" Harwick shook his head. "Seraphine was ill," he said. "Gravely so. Nature would resolve that situation on its own." Aldric picked up the quill, pressed his royal seal into the warm wax, and signed the order. 2 guards were dispatched before the candles in the hall burned down to half their height. The king returned to his other work. He did not think about the child again that evening, or the evening after that. 40 miles to the east, in a small stone cottage at the edge of Morrow Hollow, Lady Seraphine lay in a narrow bed with a fever that had been eating at her for 2 weeks. The room smelled of dried herbs and candle smoke. Outside, the autumn wind moved through the trees in long, slow waves. Seraphine had once been a woman of the court. She had worn silk and attended royal dinners, and known how to carry herself in rooms full of powerful people. That version of her life felt like something that had happened to someone else. She had left it behind 3 years ago, and she had never once allowed herself to regret the leaving, only what had made it necessary. The baby beside her slept without worry, the way only very young children can sleep, as though the world is a perfectly safe and reasonable place. She had named him Rowan. She had chosen the name herself, sitting alone in this cottage 8 months before he arrived, pressing her hand against her stomach and speaking to him in whispers so the neighbors would not hear. She had never told anyone who his father was. Not because she was ashamed, she had thought about it carefully, more carefully than people might have expected from a woman in her situation, and she had decided that the truth would damage more than it would help. It would create a storm around a child who deserved quieter skies. And so she had said nothing, and the village had assumed what villages always assume, and a man named Caden had been connected to the story simply because he had once publicly defended her in a market dispute, and gossip had decided that meant something it did not. Now, lying in her bed with the fever pulling her thoughts in strange directions, Seraphine understood that she was running out of time to protect the secret she had been carrying alone. She called for Sister Marin. The old midwife arrived within the hour. She was a small woman, wide at the shoulders, with hands that had caught more babies than she could count, and a face that had long since decided it was too busy for unnecessary expressions. She had delivered Rowan herself, in this very room, on a cold February night, and she had asked no questions and kept every confidence. Seraphine reached under her pillow and pulled out a sealed letter. The wax was pressed with her family's crest, a mark she had not used in years. "If I do not survive the week," she said, and her voice was steady, even though her hands were not. "This letter must reach the king, not Harwick, not the court, the king himself, with his own eyes. Promise me." Sister Marin took the letter. She promised. 3 days later, Seraphine closed her eyes for the last time. The fever had won, which fevers sometimes do. regardless of how much a person still has left to do. The two royal guards reached Morrow Hollow after 2 days of riding. They arrived after midnight, when the village was quiet and dark, and they moved through the narrow lanes without announcing themselves. They were not cruel men. They were simply men who had been given an order by a king whose seal they respected more than their own judgment, which is both the strength and the great failing of loyal soldiers everywhere. What they did not know was that Sister Maren had heard about them before they arrived. A village is a collection of people who notice everything and say more than they should, and when two men in royal colors had stopped to water their horses at the Crossroads Inn 5 miles back, someone had heard them speaking. That someone had a cousin in Morrow Hollow. That cousin had run. By the time the guards reached the cottage, Sister Maren had wrapped the baby in 2 layers of wool, placed him carefully in a wide market basket lined with a sheepskin, and slipped out through the back garden into the darkness of the tree line. The guards found an empty cradle and a fire that had burned down to ash. They searched for 2 days. They found nothing. A determined old woman, who had spent 60 years walking those forests, and who knew every route, every hollow, and every shepherd's path, was not going to be found by 2 men on horseback who did not know the land. When the guards returned to the capital, they reported to Lord Harwick that the task had been completed. Harwick, who preferred clean conclusions over complicated ones, wrote down what they told him and moved on to other matters. He did not tell the king that anything had been done at all. The order had been given. The order had been carried out. As far as Harwick was concerned, the chapter was closed. Sister Maren walked for 6 days. She slept in barns and under trees, and once in a shepherd's empty hut that smelled of animals but had a dry floor. She fed Rowan from supplies she had thought to bring. A cloth soaked in goat's milk, kept warm against her body. He was a calm baby, which she considered a mercy. He slept more than he cried, and when he did cry, she walked faster, which seemed to settle him. She arrived at the capital on a Tuesday, and was turned away at the castle gate before she could finish her first sentence. She returned the following morning, and was turned away again, this time less politely. On the 3rd morning, she stood in the outer courtyard and raised her voice to a volume that surprised even her. She said that she carried a letter for the king personally, that it concerned a matter of royal importance that she would not describe to anyone below the rank of the king himself, and that she was 71 years old and had walked 6 days through cold weather and was not leaving until someone with authority listened to her. A minor court official was sent to deal with her, mostly to restore the courtyard's peace. He glanced at the sealed letter out of mild curiosity, and then he looked again, because the crest pressed into the wax was one he recognized from old court records. He stood for a moment, holding the letter with the careful stillness of someone who realizes they may be holding something more important than it first appeared. The letter reached King Aldric that Thursday evening, just before the dinner bell. He opened it alone, standing at the window of his private chamber, with the last light of the day coming through the glass. He read it once quickly, then he sat down, which he had not intended to do. Then he read it again, slowly, from the beginning. Seraphine had written everything. She had written it clearly, without anger, which somehow made it harder to read than anger would have been. She described the 2 years they had spent together before Queen Isolde had been chosen, the evenings and the letters, and the things that had been genuine between them. She described the moment she realized she was carrying his child, and the decision she had made to say nothing and go quietly, because she loved him enough to protect him from the damage the truth would have caused. She wrote about Rowan, his name, his face, his small ordinary habits. She wrote that he had the king's eyes, and she wrote it simply, as a fact, not as an accusation. The final line of the letter was short. It said, "His name is Rowan. He has your eyes. I hope he never has to know what this world will ask of him." Aldric sat on the floor of his chamber, with his back against the cold stone wall. The parchment was still in his hands. Outside, the dinner bell rang and then stopped. After a long time, he stood up and summoned the guard who had ridden east 3 weeks ago. The soldier, standing before his king in the firelight, understood very quickly that honesty was now safer than its opposite. He admitted that the mission had not been completed. The cottage had been empty. The child had not been found. He had reported success to Lord Harwick, because the alternative had seemed worse. Aldric listened without moving. Then he dismissed the soldier and sat back down. The boy was alive. He held that fact in his mind for a moment, turning it over carefully, the way a man holds something fragile that he is afraid to grip too tightly or set down too quickly. The boy was alive. The next morning, Aldric called Lord Harwick into his private study. No court, no attendance, just the two of them, and the signed execution order lying flat on the table between them. Aldric looked at Harwick for a long moment and then asked, very quietly, whether Harwick had known whose child that was. The silence that followed lasted 2 seconds longer than an innocent man's silence would have. Harwick said that he had not known with certainty. He had suspected, he admitted, that the timing of Seraphine's departure from court 3 years prior had not been entirely straightforward, but a suspicion, he said, was not knowledge, and the decision had seemed reasonable based on what he believed he knew. Aldric said, "You advised me to execute my own son." He did not shout. He did not strike anything. His voice was perfectly level, which was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. A man who shouts is a man who has lost control of himself. A man who speaks that quietly in that moment has become something colder and more certain than anger. Harwick was removed from his position before the sun reached midday. His titles were taken. He left the castle that evening with nothing that had been given to him by the crown, which was most of what he had. Sister Marin was still waiting in the lower courtyard when a castle attendant came to tell her the king was coming down. She had expected to be brought upstairs. She had prepared herself for a grand room with high ceilings and men in formal clothing looking at her from behind tables. Instead, she heard footsteps on the stone passage and looked up to find a man in a plain wool cloak walking toward her across the courtyard, attended by only one guard. She had seen the king before, years ago, at a distance. He had been younger then. He looked older now in a specific way, not weakened, but weighted. She did not bow. She was too tired and too honest. And somewhere in the 6 days of walking she had decided that she had earned the right to simply stand and let him come to her. Aldric stopped in front of her. He looked at the basket. Then he looked at Rowan. Rowan looked back at him with the completely open and undefended expression that belongs only to very young children and to people who have genuinely stopped being afraid. Aldric reached out one hand, a large hand, roughened by years of riding and training, and Rowan, with no hesitation and no understanding of what he was doing, reached out and wrapped his small fingers around the king's index finger and held on with the surprising, solid grip of a healthy 4-month-old who has no idea what trust costs. Something in Aldric's face shifted. It was not a dramatic change. It was the small, quiet change of a door opening in a room that had been closed for a very long time. He looked at Sister Marin and said, "He stays. He is safe. You have my word, and this time, I will sign nothing I have not read myself." Rowan grew up inside the castle walls. It was complicated, the way that honest things in royal courts are always complicated, and it took careful and sometimes painful conversations and more than a few months of difficult negotiations before his place was formally acknowledged. But he lived. He grew. He was given a name, a title, and a room with a window that faced east so that the morning light came through first thing. He never sat on Aldric's throne. That was not the story he was given, but it was not the story he needed. Sister Marin was offered a room in the castle's east wing. She said no twice and yes on the third offer, which she later told people was simply because the room had a very good fireplace. And King Aldric, in the final years of his reign, became known among his clerks and advisors for one unusual habit. No matter how minor the document, no matter how routine the decree, he read everything himself before touching the quill. Every word, every line. He reviewed each paper with a slowness and attention that sometimes frustrated the people waiting. When they asked him why, he would look up from the page and say, simply and without further explanation, "Because a king's signature is not ink, it is consequence." Nobody who heard him say it ever forgot it. And somewhere in the castle, in a room with an east-facing window, a boy named Rowan slept soundly, held safe by a truth that had finally been spoken aloud, and by a father who had learned, just in time, the difference between signing a paper and understanding what it means.